Hello once again, and Tony here with a review of Home Alone 2 Lost in New York, which was shown yesterday on YTV. The film was directed once again by Chris Columbus. Returning as the writer and producer of this film was John Hughes, and reprising their main roles were Macaulay Culkin, Joe Pesci, Daniel Stern, Catherine O'Hara, John Hurd, and also featuring the talents of Dana Ivey, Tim Curry, Brenda Fricker, and Eddie Bracken. Now, since Home Alone was the highest grossing film of 1990, and since it made a lot of money in the box office, even after Christmas, the people behind Home Alone saw that it was extremely fit to make a sequel. Now, the sequel was kind of well received, albeit with some negative critiques. People liked it because of how much more of an edge the sequel had. Others didn't care for it because it was basically the same thing happening over again. And some people thought that it's just an okay sequel, nothing more. And I was basically watching the sequel as well ever since I was like 5 or 8 years old, and I liked it. And I even bought the VCD ever since I was about 13 or 14, and I really enjoyed it. Actually, I enjoyed both incarnations a lot, because they both have a very special fondness for me. So where does this sequel fall in? Is it as good as the original? Is it as okay as the original? Or does it falter? Let's find out right now. Now, story-wise, it does contain the same formula of the original Home Alone. Kevin gets into trouble. His mother reprimands him. Something happens to their alarm clock, forcing them to leave the house in a huff after one of the, or two of the trucks end up, coming in, and one of them, runs over a statuette. Family leaves in a huff. And this time it's quite different, because this time Kevin is on the trip, but he gets on the wrong flight. Now, there's also some more similarities, like the gangster film that Kevin watches. In this, it's known as Angels with Even Filthier Souls. The montage of Kevin coming up with all of these elaborate traps for the crooks, and everything else in between. However, what makes the sequel slightly different than the original is that the Wet Bandits, Harry and Marv, pose more of a threat to Kevin, since Harry has a gun. And, well, oh yes, there is also another element of this film that is also quite similar to the original. The fact that there is a misunderstood old person, but this time in the form of a much younger person, and in the form of a pigeon woman, who is usually seen outside Central Park with a whole flock of pigeons, some on her shoulder, some on her other shoulder, and some on her hat. And she basically feeds them every day and night. And both of them have very tragic pasts, which I dare not spoil. And of course, the ending is usually consisting of something very heartwarming for the next few seconds, but Kevin gets into trouble once again. Yeah. I can understand why people don't really care for the sequel, because there are moments in which it feels like the same film over again. But then again, it also works in the film's favor, because since we know about the original Home Alone, we are also expected to also understand that this is also what it is as a Home Alone film. It doesn't lose its identity. You can tell from the music they still use, which is also another element that this film also reuses from the original movie. So yes, even though the story is very much similar to the original, it does take some chances into making the the wet bandits a lot more threatening. And not to mention, the hotel staff also do pose as secondary antagonists towards Kevin, as opposed to the one time Kevin was accidentally caught shoplifting in a convenience store, and that was just it. The hotel staff do prove to be quite the secondary antagonists to Kevin, especially Mr. Hector, which I'll get to his character later. So, even though the sequel didn't do anything that's spectacularly new, it still managed to be very entertaining and very much a great ride that kept me hooked from point A to point B. The cinematography is still handled very well, and I especially love the locations. The hugest highlights for me, location-wise, were obviously Central Park, Grand Plaza Hotel, and everything else that the city of New York basically had to offer at the time. It's just that fantastic all around. The characters still have their charm, especially that of Kevin. He still has his snark, he still has his badass moments in which he sets up the trap, and he finds himself in a more interesting and slightly more dangerous position. And I actually like that in this film. The fact that Kevin has found himself in a lot more dangerous and a very much more life-threatening position, given the fact that he is in New York, makes me realize that, well, if he can survive being in his own, why not someplace like New York? And he does it pretty well. Almost too well for a 10-year-old kid. But still, he's very much a great character. He still keeps up his greatness all throughout, and his scream still stays intact. Now, with Harry and Marv, like I've said, both of them have become a bit more of a threat than the original. Sure, they still keep up with their bumbling antics. However, during the climax, Harry becomes a lot more threatening. And the same thing with Marv, albeit just a smidge. But it's Harry that becomes slightly more threatening. And their scheme to rob gets a lot more grander scaled, as they no longer want to rob houses, but also they want to rob toy stores, the ones that have charity written all over it. So the fact that they've ended up stepping up their game is definitely something to behold. Now, Kate is also great in this film as well. She still has that stern, motherly nature. Then when she finds out that Kevin is in New York and is all alone, she keeps up that determination, just like in the first film, but she doesn't need any help from like outside forces, save for like a policeman, because in the first film, she ended up having help through a traveling musician by the name of Gus Polinski, lovingly played by John Candy. Though with this film, she only had a little bit of help from a policeman, who we didn't really get his name, but understands the position that she is in. And I won't spoil what happened between Kate and Kevin, but it's almost quite similar to what happened in the first movie. But still, she's still a good character. Peter, though not having a lot to do, still manages to be a pretty good foil to Kate. I mean, compared to Kate, who is usually uptight, stern, and always finds herself in a tizzy, Peter maintains his calm and level-headed nature pretty damn well. And Uncle Frank, whether you like him or hate him, he still kept up his lovable asshole nature. You know, the type of asshole nature that makes you want to smile at times and not make you want to throw something at him. Yeah, he still kept up his asshole nature hilariously. However, if there are problems with certain characters of the McAllister family, I have to say that aside from like Buzz, who gets a lot of screen time, or gets a majority of the screen time in the smaller characters, the rest of the McAllister siblings are basically reduced to cameos. For example, Megan doesn't really have that much lines, nor does she have a lot to contribute. Lenny is sadly reduced to being a cameo. The same thing can be said about Jeff, and the same thing can be said about all the cousins, and which is quite sad because I would have loved to see them a lot more fleshed out and developed. However, there are still some entertaining characters, though there's not a huge amount of depth, like Mr. Hector, Miss Stone, and Cedric. They are all quite good secondary antagonists to Kevin, especially that of Mr. Hector. I mean, the way he is quite the ham and basically is so suspicious of Kevin's every move is just enough to make you feel a bit uncomfortable. And with Cedric, even though he doesn't really have a lot to do, he basically is the resident funny man, as his running gag is, instead of getting a cash tip, he basically gets a gum tip. With Miss Stone, well, she doesn't really have that much to do, though in her interaction with Kevin as Kevin is about to check in, she's shown to be quite sardonic and quite level-headed. The Pigeon Woman is also quite interesting as well. However, unlike Marley from the original movie, we don't know her name. We only get a vague background of what she went through, but nothing more. We don't know her name. We don't know where she truly came from, but unlike Marley, and I know this is a little bit of a spoiler, she doesn't really have a family member. She doesn't really have any family members that she could relate to or talk to. She only had an ex-boyfriend who ended up dumping her. Hence, her lonely state as a pigeon woman. So yes, the main characters still have their charm. However, I would have loved to see a lot more development in the side characters as well, especially that of the siblings and the cousins. I mean, in the original, the only siblings that managed to have a smidge amount of development were basically that of Buzz and Megan. But that's pretty much it. Even though Buzz's role was slightly smaller, he still had a good amount of lines. The rest of them, only this little, and they didn't really have that much of an impact on the story, other than, okay, Kevin is in New York, let's go and catch up with him. That's it. But still, despite some gripes with the characters and how they developed, I still have to say that the acting is still great. And I especially love Catherine O'Hara's Kate. There is nobody like her in this role. She managed to put all of the stops, especially that in her faint scene. Now that was just gold right there. Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern managed to do fantastically as the bandits and still keep up with their comic timing, though still make them slightly more threatening. And Macaulay Culkin as Kevin, come on. He's Macaulay Culkin. Kevin is his signature role. So overall, this sequel, while it's very enjoyable, I found out that there were some elements that were quite flawed, especially that in the character development department. In the minor characters, the major characters do get a fair amount of development, but not really in that of the minor characters. But I will say this, it's still very enjoyable, and what I've noticed is, if you compare the booby traps that Kevin used in the original Home Alone, yeah, the sequel ends up getting a lot more dangerous, to the point where these booby traps can end up killing you. So yeah, they managed to up the ante up a little bit for this sequel, even though they could have done a lot better in the character development department. So with that said, I give Home Alone 2 Lost in New York 3.5 out of 5 stars. Sure, it does have its flaws, but this is guaranteed enjoyment. You will not feel bored. The elements of the original Home Alone are still there, and it's still alive and fresh. It doesn't stray away from the source material. It's still a good sequel, and it may not be the greatest sequel, but it's still a really good sequel. And what do I think about Home Alone 3? Well, I don't really care for it. The fact that they replaced Kevin with another boy by the name of Alex was just really something. It does have its moments here and there, but I don't really care for it. And if you really want to know my honest grade on this film, I'd rather slap a 2 out of 5. There are some elements that are quite funny, but I don't want to go back to there again. But stay tuned for the next video as I discuss what is pretty much the Home Alone sequel that ends up going down the barrel for me. Oh, yes. And I'm really sure you all know what it is. So, see you later, and God help me.